The words stopped me cold in the hallway. My hand was still on the banister, one foot lifted to take the next step down, and I just froze. The voice was my son's, and what he was saying turned everything I thought I knew about my life into rubble. My name is Edward Morrison. Ed, to anyone who actually knows me. I'm 68 years old, retired high school history teacher, widower for 4 years. And for most of my life, I considered myself a pretty good judge of character. 32 years in a classroom. You learn to read people. You learn when a student is lying about their homework, when a parent is hiding something behind a smile, when something is off, even if you can't immediately explain why. I thought that skill was mine permanently. I thought it had been wired into me after all those years. I was wrong, because I had missed the most important thing sitting right in front of me for over a year. Let me go back to the beginning. To a Tuesday morning in September, in my house in Fort Wayne, Indiana, the house where I raised my son Nathan, and where I had lived with my wife Patricia for 26 years before she passed. The maple tree in the backyard had just started turning orange. I remember that specifically because I was looking at it through the kitchen window when Nathan called to tell me he had a surprise for me. He sounded warm, excited even. That was the thing about Nathan. He could sound exactly the way you wanted him to sound. He had always been good at that. When he was 16 and wanted to borrow the car, his voice went soft and earnest. When he needed money for his first business venture that went nowhere, he became the most loving son you had ever seen. I noticed these patterns over the years, the way a gentle current pulls you one way if you're not paying attention. But I always told myself that's just Nathan. That's just how he is. He means well. He told me he had been thinking about me a lot lately. Said he was worried I was isolating myself too much since Patricia died. He wasn't wrong about that. I had pulled back from a lot of things. The house was quieter than I knew how to handle, and some weeks the only people I spoke to were the cashier at the grocery store and my neighbor Roy, who would stop by occasionally to check on me. Nathan lived 3 hours away in Columbus with his wife Claire and their 2 kids, and his visits had become less frequent over the years. So when he called and sounded concerned, I felt something I was ashamed to feel grateful, relieved, like maybe the distance between us was finally being bridged. He said he wanted to give me something, a trip, a real one, not just a weekend somewhere. He had been reading about how therapeutic long train journeys were for people dealing with grief and isolation. He talked about the scenery, the rhythm of the rails, the way distance gave you perspective on your life. He said he had found a perfect route from Fort Wayne down to Indianapolis, then connecting all the way out to Flagstaff, Arizona. 3 days of travel. He had already spoken to my old Army friend Dennis, who had retired to Sedona 15 years ago and had apparently been asking about me. Nathan had arranged for me to stay with Dennis for 2 weeks, rest, breathe the desert air, and come back feeling like myself again. I was moved. I genuinely was. I told him it was one of the kindest things he had ever done for me. He laughed and said I deserved it. He told me not to worry about anything, that he and Claire would check on the house while I was gone. He said they might even stay there a few days, take the kids to some of the places he remembered from childhood. It all sounded so natural, so thoughtful. The tickets arrived in my email 2 days later. I printed them out and set them on the kitchen counter next to my coffee mug. I started making a list of things to pack. I texted Dennis, who confirmed everything enthusiastically, said he had a guest room all ready, that the weather in Sedona was beautiful in September, and that we had too many years of catching up to do. I went to bed that night, feeling lighter than I had in months. I should have looked more carefully at the ticket. It was 9 days before my departure date. Nathan and Claire had driven up for the weekend, ostensibly to help me prepare for the trip. Claire busied herself in the kitchen making what she called a farewell dinner, and Nathan helped me sort through some things in the garage. It felt domestic and normal. My grandkids, Tyler and Alyssa, chased each other around the backyard under the orange maple. I watched them through the back door and felt something close to happiness. That night, after the kids were asleep, Nathan and Claire sat in the living room with a glass of wine, and I excused myself to go upstairs. I was tired. I said goodnight, climbed the stairs, and I had just reached the landing when I heard Claire's voice, low and certain, carrying up through the old house's thin walls. She was saying that it would take about 10 days to get everything listed, that the agent they had spoken to thought the market was still strong, and a house in this neighborhood, in this condition, could move fast. Maybe 2 weeks, maybe less. I stood there without breathing. Nathan said something I couldn't make out. Then Claire again, clearer this time. By the time he gets to Sedona and realizes Dennis doesn't know anything about it, we'll already have an offer. Dennis doesn't know anything about it. I put my hand on the wall to keep my balance. She kept talking. She mentioned a facility in Scottsdale. She mentioned a name, Sunrise Ridge. She said it was highly rated, that she had already spoken to the admissions coordinator, that they had a room available the following month. She said once he was settled and the house was sold, it would all be much simpler. She used the word simpler twice. Nathan said, quietly, that he still wasn't sure, that this felt extreme. Claire said, Nathan, he's 68, he's alone, he's not going to fight it. And we've been waiting for him to make his own arrangements for 2 years, and he hasn't done it. We're doing him a favor. There was a long pause. Then Nathan said, okay. I climbed the rest of the stairs and sat on the edge of my bed in the dark for a very long time. I want to try to explain what that moment felt like, but I'm not sure I have the right words even now. It wasn't like anger, not at first. It was more like the floor had simply disappeared, and I was suspended in a place where nothing I had believed was reliable anymore. Every conversation from the past year shuffled through my mind and rearranged itself. The questions Nathan had started asking about the house's value. The way Claire had steered a conversation once toward whether I had updated my power of attorney. The weekend visits that always seemed to include a casual tour through the rooms, Nathan pausing to look at things with his hands in his pockets. I had read all of it as love, as family, as a son keeping an eye on his father. It had been an inventory. I did not go downstairs. I did not confront them. And I'll tell you why. Because people ask me this, why didn't you just call them out right then? The answer is that I knew, with a cold clarity that surprised me, that if I walked into that living room, I would lose every advantage I had. They would deny it. Claire would cry. Nathan would talk in circles. And then they would adjust their plan, hide it better, and I would be left with nothing but my own word against theirs. I needed to think. So I sat in the dark and I thought. By 4 a.m, I had a plan of my own. I was going to get on that train. Not because I didn't know what was waiting at the other end, but because the train was where I could move freely, communicate without being watched, and give myself the time to do what needed to be done before Nathan made his next move. If I confronted them now and they scrambled, the house could be listed in days. If I played along, smiled at breakfast, waved goodbye at the station, I bought myself 3 days of travel, and 2 weeks, they thought I was safely out of the way. I went to sleep just before dawn. In the morning I came downstairs and ate breakfast with my son and his wife and my grandchildren, and I smiled. And I talked about the trip, and I asked Claire about her recipe for the chicken she had made the night before. I don't know where I found the calmness, maybe from Patricia, somehow. She was always the steady one. The day Nathan and Claire drove back to Columbus, I made 3 phone calls. The first was to my attorney, a woman named Barbara Simmons, who had handled Patricia's estate and who I trusted completely. I told her what I had heard and what I intended to do, and I asked her to prepare documents revoking Nathan's limited power of attorney over my financial accounts and confirming that I was of sound mind and fully competent to manage my own affairs. She told me she could have everything ready within 48 hours and that I should be very careful. I told her I would be. The second call was to my bank, where I spoke to the branch manager I had known for 11 years, and I put a freeze on all transactions above $500 that weren't initiated directly by me. The third call was to Dennis. Dennis answered on the second ring. When I told him what I had overheard, there was a silence so long I thought the call had dropped. Then he said, in his old sergeant's voice, the one he used when something made him furious, but he was controlling it. "Tell me what you need, Ed." I told him. He said he would be ready. On the morning of my departure, Nathan drove up alone to take me to the station. Claire had stayed in Columbus, he said, with the kids. He carried my bag to the platform and he hugged me and told me to enjoy the trip, that the desert was going to do me good. I looked at his face while he said it, and I tried to find something there. Some flicker that told me he knew what he was doing was wrong. I don't know if I found it or just wanted to. I boarded the train and found my seat by the window and watched him on the platform until the train pulled away. The first hours of the journey, I kept my head down and stayed in my seat. The Indiana farmland rolled past, flat and wide and familiar. The kind of landscape I had spent 68 years inside without ever really seeing. After a while, I went to the dining car to get coffee, and that was where I met Frank. He was sitting alone at a table by the window, somewhere in his early 70s, broad-shouldered even now, with close-cropped white hair and the kind of careful, watchful way of holding himself that I recognized from men I had known in the army. He was reading a paperback and drinking black coffee, and when I asked if the seat across from him was taken, he looked up and said, "It's all yours, friend." We talked, carefully at first, the way strangers do weather, where we were headed, what we'd done with our working lives. Frank had been a detective with the Chicago Police Department for 27 years. He was recently retired and, as he put it without elaborating much, in the process of figuring out what's left. I noticed he said it without bitterness, but also without any pretense that it was simple. I liked that. There was no performance in the man. It took me until somewhere past the Illinois border to tell him the truth. I'm not entirely sure why I told him. Some instinct, I suppose, or maybe just the accumulation of 48 hours of carrying it alone. I told him about the overheard conversation, about the facility in Scottsdale, about the house listing, about sitting on the edge of my bed in the dark and deciding to get on the train anyway. Frank listened without interrupting. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment, looking out at the darkening sky. Then he said, "You're smarter than your son thinks you are." I told him that wasn't a particularly high bar right now. He smiled at that. He asked me what I had done so far to protect myself. I told him about Barbara, about the bank freeze, about calling Dennis. He nodded slowly and said, I had done the right things. Then he said, "The problem is, you don't have documentation. You have your own testimony about what you heard. A good attorney can work with that, but it's better if there's more." I told him I knew that. I told him I had been thinking about it since I boarded. He said, "Let me help you think it through." And over the next 2 hours, in the dining car, as the train crossed into Missouri, and the sky went fully dark outside, Frank and I sat with our coffee and talked through every piece of what I knew and what I could still gather. He had spent nearly 3 decades building cases, and the way he organized information was methodical and calm in a way that helped me organize my own thoughts. He told me things I hadn't thought of. Text messages. Whether Nathan had put anything in writing. Whether Claire had emailed the realtor from an account I might have access to as part of a shared family plan. He told me about elder financial abuse statutes, which vary by state but are often more serious than people expect. He told me that a facility admission, arranged without the knowledge or consent of the person being placed, is not a simple matter, that it can rise to the level of criminal conduct, depending on what documents were forged, misrepresented. I got out my phone. I had a string of messages from Nathan about the trip, cheerful and unremarkable. But I scrolled back further. 3 weeks before my departure date, Nathan had texted me asking if I remembered where I kept the pink slip on the Buick and the deed stuff. He had said he was just helping me organize. At the time, I had thought nothing of it. Now I took a screenshot and sent it to Barbara. Over the next 2 days on the train, I built a file. Barbara sent me documents to sign electronically, revoking Nathan's access entirely. I contacted my financial advisor and moved accounts. I called my homeowner's insurance agent, a friend of 20 years, and told him, under no circumstances, was he to process any listing-related requests or access requests without my direct authorization and a call to my personal cell. I texted Dennis daily updates. Frank was there through all of it. He had his own quiet grief. He was working through a daughter who barely spoke to him. Years of working too hard and being absent. The particular loneliness of a man who had spent his life protecting strangers and somehow lost his own family in the process. We did not talk about this much, but it was there between us, in the way that the real things are between two people who have been honest with each other. On the second night, somewhere in New Mexico, with the desert finally opening up outside the windows. He told me about his wife, Margaret, who had died 3 years ago. He said he still reached for her side of the bed sometimes in the morning before he remembered. I told him I knew exactly what that was. We arrived in Flagstaff on the morning of the third day. Dennis was waiting at the station. He is a big man, Dennis, former Army Ranger, built like he never fully demobilized. When he saw me, he pulled me into a hug that nearly lifted me off the ground. I introduced him to Frank, and something passed between them, two old professionals recognizing each other, and Dennis said Frank was welcome to stay as long as he needed. Frank had planned to continue south to Tucson, where he had vague plans to visit a brother he rarely saw. He changed his plans. Dennis's house in Sedona sits up on a ridge with a view of the red rock formations that I still don't have adequate words for. I sat on his porch that first afternoon and looked at it and felt something shift in my chest, not healing, not yet, but something quieter. The recognition that the world was still large and that I was still in it. Over the following days, the situation with Nathan began to accelerate. Barbara called me on my second day in Sedona to tell me that she had heard from a real estate agent's office in Fort Wayne. They were attempting to verify ownership on my property address for a listing they had been contracted to prepare. The agent had called my name on a form as the seller. Barbara had informed them that she represented me, that I was alive, present, fully competent, and that any listing agreement signed on my behalf was fraudulent. The agent had gone quiet very fast. She told me to expect Nathan to call. He called that evening. The warmth in his voice was gone. He asked where I was, why I wasn't in Scottsdale yet, what was going on. I told him I was in Sedona, visiting Dennis, just as he had arranged. He said Dennis had told him I never arrived at the original location. I said I must have mixed up the address, and wasn't it lucky Dennis was so easy to reach? There was a pause. I could almost hear him recalibrating. He said Barbara had sent a letter to his house. I said yes. I had updated my estate documents while I was traveling, just something I had been meaning to do for a while. He said in a tighter voice that he wished I had talked to him first. I said I hadn't realized I needed to. He tried a few more angles. He brought up my health, whether I was managing well on my own, whether I had thought about what happened if something went wrong. I let him talk. I listened. When he was finished, I told him calmly that I was in very good health, that I was with an old friend and a new one, that the desert air was exactly as good as he had promised, and that I was looking forward to coming home. There was a silence on the line that told me everything. I won't pretend the next 10 days were simple. There were more calls, some from Nathan, one from Claire, that I did not answer. Barbara was in near daily contact. The real estate agent, when faced with a direct letter from my attorney citing potential fraud, withdrew from the listing agreement within 24 hours. The admissions coordinator at Sunrise Ridge in Scottsdale, when Barbara contacted them and asked by whose authority they had been engaged to prepare a room for an incoming resident who had not consented to placement, became very cooperative very quickly. What Barbara uncovered over those 10 days was worse than what I had heard on the stairs. Nathan and Claire had retained the real estate agent 6 weeks before my departure. They had contacted Sunrise Ridge 4 weeks out. They had not forged documents yet. Perhaps they were waiting until I was in place and isolated, but they had made representations to both the facility and the agent that I was in, declining cognitive health, and that Nathan was acting with my knowledge and consent. Barbara told me that, in Indiana, making false statements to facilitate the involuntary placement of an elderly person carries serious legal consequences. I asked her what she recommended. She recommended we give Nathan one opportunity to step back before she filed anything. She drafted a letter that was the most precise and devastating piece of writing I had seen outside of a courtroom, and she sent it to his address on a Tuesday morning. He called me that afternoon. He was crying. I sat on Dennis's porch, looking at the red rocks, and I listened to my son cry and tell me he was sorry, that he was scared, that the money had gotten away from them, and they were in debt, and he had convinced himself that what they were doing was actually for my own good, that the house was too big for one person, and I was too isolated, and he had told himself over and over that placing me somewhere would be helping me. I let him finish. Then I said, "Nathan, if you had believed that, you would have talked to me." He didn't have an answer for that. I told him that Barbara would be in contact with the specific terms of what came next, that I did not want to destroy his life, but that I also was not going to pretend what had happened was anything other than what it was, that the house was my house and would remain so, that my money was my money, that if there were debts, they were his to manage, not mine to absorb by ceasing to exist. He said he understood. His voice was small. I hung up the phone and sat for a long time looking at the sky. What Nathan and Claire ultimately agreed to, under Barbara's terms, was a full written acknowledgement of what had been planned, a repayment agreement for the funds they had already spent pursuing the sale and placement on the assumption the plan would succeed, and a 5-year no-contact provision for Claire specifically, who Barbara believed had been the primary architect. Nathan retained the right to contact me, but under specific conditions. Whether that relationship ever becomes something real again is something I am still deciding. I think about Patricia and what she would say. She loved Nathan in a way that sometimes made me jealous. I don't think she would tell me to forget. I don't think she would tell me to rush, either. Frank drove back to Chicago 2 weeks after we arrived in Sedona. On his last morning, he sat with me on the porch while Dennis made breakfast inside, and we watched the sun hit the red rocks in that way that happens in the early hour when the light comes in low and the stone almost seems to glow from inside. He said, "You did something hard." I said I didn't feel like I did. I felt like I'd mostly made phone calls and drunk Dennis's coffee. He shook his head. He said, "You could have confronted them on the stairs and blown the whole thing up and been left with nothing. You could have gotten off the train in Indianapolis and gone back and pretended you hadn't heard anything. Instead, you stayed calm and you thought, and you protected yourself. That's not nothing. At our age, after a loss like yours, staying calm is the hardest thing there is." I looked at him. I thought about Patricia, about the quiet in the house after she left it, about the Monday mornings I had stood in the kitchen unable to think of a reason to make a full pot of coffee. I thought about Nathan's voice on the phone asking about the deed. I told Frank that I'd had help. He said that was the other part, knowing when to accept it. We shook hands on the porch, and then he pulled me into a brief, solid hug and got into his rental car. I watched the car go down the red dirt road until the dust settled. Dennis came out with 2 mugs of coffee and sat down next to me in the other chair without saying anything, which is one of the things I have always valued most about Dennis. I stayed in Sedona for another 3 weeks beyond what had originally been planned. I helped Dennis repair a section of fence on his property. I learned to cook something I would eat alone in the evenings. I read books I had been meaning to read for years. I drove to a trailhead Dennis recommended and sat on a rock at elevation for 2 hours in complete silence, looking at a landscape so old it made my 68 years feel like an afternoon. I thought about what I was going back to. The house was still mine. The maple tree had probably gone from orange to bare by now. Roy next door would have noticed my absence and would probably want a full report. Barbara had everything in order. The account balances were intact. The deed was untouched. The life I had built over 40 years was still there, waiting for me to walk back into it. That was what I was returning to. Not the house as Nathan had seen it as an asset, as an inheritance, as something to be liquidated, but as mine. A place where Patricia and I had raised a son and painted the kitchen 3 times, and replaced the water heater, and argued about landscaping, and sat in the backyard on summer evenings, so many times I couldn't count them. A place that still held the shape of my life. I flew home on a Wednesday in late October. Fort Wayne in fall has a specific smell. Cold coming in, dry leaves, the first edge of wood smoke from someone's fireplace. I stood outside the terminal and breathed it in, and something in me that had been held tight for 6 weeks finally loosened. Roy came over that first evening with a casserole his wife had made, because that is who Roy is. And he sat in my kitchen while I ate and asked where I had been, and I told him a shortened version that still took 45 minutes to get through. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Ed, did you know the maple in your backyard is the best one on the whole street?" I told him I knew. He said, "It's still there." I understood what he meant. Frank and I talk on the phone every couple of weeks. He and his brother in Tucson have apparently repaired something between them. He mentioned it once, briefly, in the way he mentions things that matter to him, which is to say, without ceremony. Dennis is coming to Fort Wayne in the spring. He has never been to Indiana in his life, and I have promised him it is more interesting than he expects, which may or may not be true, but he is coming anyway. Barbara told me recently that the situation with Nathan and Claire had been resolved as completely as it was likely to be resolved, legally speaking. She said I handled it better than most people in my position would have. I told her I had good help. She said that was probably the difference. I think about that sometimes. About what would have happened if I had stood up from that staircase, landing and walked into the living room, if I had shouted, if I had broken down, if I had let the shock make the decision for me instead of making it myself. I think about all the versions of that night where I did not hold still, where I did not sit in the dark and think, where I did not get on the train. I got on the train. And here is what I know now that I did not know on that September morning when I handed my bag to my son on the platform and watched his face arrange itself into something that looked like love. The end of one thing is not the end. Nathan is my son, and that fact has not changed and probably never will, and what we make of it going forward is still to be determined. The house is standing, the maple is bare now, but it will come back. There are people in my life, Dennis, Frank, Roy, Barbara, who I would not trade for anything. I am 68 years old. I am a retired teacher and a widower, and a man who once sat in the dark on the edge of his bed and decided to think instead of react. And I am telling you that what I learned on that train, in that desert, in those 3 weeks on Dennis's porch, looking at the red rocks, is that your life belongs to you. Not to whoever thinks they have the right to decide what's left of it. Not to whoever is waiting for you to give up and step aside. Yours, entirely and completely. And if someone tries to take it from you, you make sure you are ready. I was ready